Hello and welcome to the fourth webinar for Essential Sociology, getting ready for paper 2. Now this is for the family and household unit. Now within today's webinar, what we're planning to do is cover some of the most essential topics that have so far come up within the family unit. Now these tricky topics are the sociology of personal life, surveillance and confluent love. And then we're going to practice about ways you can embed social policies into your exam answers. And from there, we're going to look at some examples in terms of essay writing frameworks. Now, with the tricky topics, we are discussing some of the topics that students often find the most difficult. So for the topics, these are relatively new to the specification, and we'll analyse some contemporary issues which can influence the family overall. Now, this is where I think sometimes it causes a bit of a hang-up, because as we start to look at these issues, we think, hang on, can it be that simple? And now what we're trying to do today is bring it back to that. Now, with the topics we're going to look in greater detail over is the sociology of personal life, surveillance and confluent love. Now, these three areas, especially surveillance, can be linked to alternative areas within the specification as well. Now, the sociology of personal life is a new area within sociology that has allowed for us to discuss and uncover some of the new forms of family networks that have occurred. Now, within this area, there is a focus on life course as a key term. Now, for those of us that are unsure about what this key term actually means, it simply is the expected steps in individuals to take during their lifetime. Now, for example, in a traditional life course, you'd be expected to go to school, start dating someone, get married, and then have children. Now, the problem is, in modern society, these life courses have changed, and a new form of extended adolescence has occurred, and which means traditional life courses no longer fit in with the individual's life. Now, what we mean by this is individuals have now started to spend more time trying to find themselves, as we can only label as the eat, pray, love generation, by which they're happy to take gap years and explore and find out who they are within, as it were. Now, SMART begins to really take this discussion about sociology of personal life to a new level by arguing that within modern society there has been a decline in individuals going to biological relatives for help. Now, due to the changes in norms and values related to the life course, individuals increasingly rely on the family. Now, the family, if you want to use a key term, this simply means that we're looking at a network of friends who are there to support and help the individual, rather than them turning to their kinship networks. Now, this provides an alternative network of support for the individual. Now, Shorter agrees with this argument by stating that there has been a move away from families operating as domestic economies in favour of relationships based on partnership and companionship, which means that we no longer see the family as a unit by which we have to be a part of in order to survive within our society. It is something by which we can pick and choose and decide whether or not we want to be part of. That means we can pursue alternative networks as and when if we want to. Now, Lewis suggests that this has occurred in part because the extent to which public moral codes is imposed on the individual has decreased. Now, this means that we are free to pursue and create new ways of living and new family options and new kinship networks, as it were. Now, this means that the imposed moral code of the serial packet family, by which the function is held in high regard, by where we've got mum, dad and 2.5 children as the main and only type of family, is actually decreasing in the public moral code because individuals are choosing alternative methods. Now, an example of this is the increasing number of children born outside of marriage and conceptions via artificial insemination. Now, Lewis can be supported by a very interesting app that's just been developed and launched in Australia. The example of this app is the Just Baby app, which acts as a dating site for sperm donors and egg donors. Now, this sees these alternative ways of having children as more acceptable within modern society, meaning the stigma with having children using these methods has significantly declined, which can be linked with the change in life course individuals have experienced. So, for example, a woman might decide to put off having children till much later in their lives, which means that they won't have the time to sit there and nurture a loving relationship because they want to focus on their career potentially. That means they will rely on things like artificial insemination or finding a sperm donor in order to have children. Now, in addition to this, the public moral code has become more accepting of these alternative family options, meaning individuals are free to explore these methods without fear of stigma. Now, May argues that there is a need to use sociology of personal life to develop a discussion around relationships, because families are no longer the centre of people's lives. Within this in mind, we need to look to extend our analysis beyond the family towards a wider social networks, and by doing so, we'll understand how these networks are benefiting the individual. Now, within the webinar, I asked you guys to think about the different ways in which the family is watched or controlled, and I got you to theorise and come up with some examples of social institutions. Now, with the answers that we got laws, we got the family itself, we even got social workers, we've got police, we got all of these different institutions that were there mentioned. Now, when we're talking about the next area, we're focusing on surveillance. Now, surveillance is all about how these institutions have been specially designed to ensure that the family is controlled. Now, Michel Foucault is a French philosopher whom theorised about surveillance within society. He wanted to understand how wider networks acted as a form of social control. Now, he labelled this as panopticism. Now, panopticism is whereby he applied to prisons to see how control and surveillance was exerted on prisoners at all time through architectural design and disciplinary mechanisms. Now, we take these ideas and apply it to wider society, understanding how society has structured itself in a way by which it can control the family unit and make sure that they're adhering to social norms and values. Now, this is where Foucault comes into the argument that individuals are encountering surveillance by both formal and informal social control methods. This means that they are being used to enforce the social norms on parenting and family life. Furthermore, informal methods now tend to be internalised, so the individual becomes more aware of them themselves, by which the individual then enforces and modifies their own behaviour to ensure that they are meeting the norms and values by which they are very much aware of. Therefore, as a result, we rely less and less on social institutions to monitor people's behaviour, because we ourselves are monitoring and making sure that we are behaving in adequate ways. Now you're thinking, we've covered Foucault, that's something that we've spoken about within crime and deviance. How can we definitely make this relate to the family? Now, this is what Henderson has done phenomenally well in terms of applying Foucault's concepts to motherhood and the family in itself. Now, once the norms and values of a desirable family life have been established by agencies like the media and social workers, it is then down to the mothers to exercise the control over one another. Now, as they become aware of their expectations, they criticise and judge other mothers about their parenting styles and consumer choices, such as the type of food that they give their child. Now, if a mother decides to give their child wholeheartedly unhealthy food, the rest of the mothers will judge them at the school gate, making them feel guilty about their choices. Now, he argues that self-surveillance is accomplished by eliciting feelings of guilt amongst mothers when they do not live up to their self-imposed expectations. A modern example by which we can use is the use of breastfeeding campaigns. Now, this is an example of how guilt is used to impose and control behaviour. Now, they use highly emotive language and facts and figures which change a woman's mind and elicit particularly harrowing feelings about how they are treating their child. Now, this is all about their relating to their choice of formula feeding or breastfeeding. Now, often the campaigns that are used elicit these feelings of shame about the mother's choice, as they are not providing their child with the best start in life. Now, babies that breastfeed are likely to have a stronger immune system compared to babies that are formula fed. Now, those types of facts are introduced, and with those facts, individuals become increasingly more and more guilty about their choices and become more and more aware of the choices that they've made. Therefore, if the child was likely to emerge as a deviant, they would argue that the mother never self-imposed and controlled and made sure that the child was socialised into adequate norms and values, by which she will be held accountable later on in life. Now, within society, we're seeing a growing increase of individualization. Now, this means that we become more inwardly focused and more concerned about how things benefit us. Now, Chambers supports this view by stating that this focus has changed our views around love, commitment, and developed new kinds of personal relationships as a response to this, whereby individuals are no longer focused around fulfilling expectations or adhering to traditional labels. So, for example, individuals can date each other for an extended period of time and never solidify it as a traditional relationship because they don't want to adhere to traditional expectations. So they could forever be in the dating game, as it were. Now, the person who really brings this to life even more so is the idea of postmodernists, because they say that we've entered into this postmodern world by where we are so inwardly focused and concerned about how things can be beneficial for ourselves. Now, obviously, Chamber then continues this discussion because we've become more focused on how to gain gratification, love and satisfaction from the relationships. And by doing so, we're creating what we'll call a pure relationship. A relationship that is meeting and benefiting all of the individuals that are involved. Now, Giddens, a postmodernist, states that individuals are moving away from traditional notion of romantic love, by which when we talk about a traditional notion of romantic love, we'll talk about the idea that society has put an expectation on how a relationship should be structured, by which we are rejecting that. We're rejecting actually how and why we should not follow these traditional notions of romantic love. He says that we've started to follow the notion of confluent love. Now, this is a new postmodern type way of showing affection. Now, this is where an individual seeks to form a pure relationship which is primarily focused around the individual, ensuring the relationship is beneficial to all involved. Should the relationship cease to fulfill this role, a divorce or separation ensues so that the hunt for something better can resume. So therefore, we no longer see people restricting themselves to this one relationship, trying to make it work, trying to make it beneficial, because as soon as it stops being beneficial for those individuals, they will no longer pursue the rest of the relationship. Now, all three areas that we've just covered, surveillance, personal life, and confluent love, are all postmodern ideas, as it were. They are all saying how society has shifted away from these traditional expectations and we are becoming this more aware, more inwardly focused group of people by which we're going to seek for making sure we've got alternative networks that are giving us support, making sure that we are pursuing relationships that are pure and allow for us to receive gratification. However, the counterbalance is we are always surveying ourselves, making sure that we're adhering to the current norms and values that are most dominant within the society. Now, when we're talking about this in the webinar, we're talking about the idea of using policy to bring your answers to life. Now, policy is one of those things which is often understated and never really investigated that further within answers. Now, when you use policy, it demonstrates a fantastic understanding of issues that are surrounding the family. Now, this will convince the examiner that you have a wealth of knowledge that can be applied to a multitude of topics. Now, when you do use a social policy, make sure you are evaluating it in some way. Use the different sociological perspectives to say whether this is a fantastic policy or this policy is completely rubbish, because this will show off your sociological imagination and your understanding of the topic material. Now, from the table here, you can see that I've identified 4 main primary pieces of policy. Now, there are other policies out there, so obviously don't limit yourself to these. Now, what I've done over the top of it, there is Marxism, functionalism, and feminism, by which we're going to explore and go through what they all say about each one of those policies in a second. Now, the first policy that we're looking at here is the Beveridge Report of 1942. Now, the Beveridge Report was absolutely groundbreaking and essential piece of policy by which you need to know about. Now, the Beveridge Report was written by Sir William Beveridge, and it provided a summary of principles necessary to banish poverty and want from society. Now, from the report, Beveridge identified the 5 giants of society, which were want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. Now, these giants were then credited for society's problems, and he believed we needed to change something within society to ensure individuals are provided with the support to banish these giants. By doing so, we get rid of society's problems. Now, this report laid the foundations of the welfare state, free healthcare, and the idea of cradle-to-grave support, which was later introduced in 1945 by Clement Attlee, the Labour Prime Minister. Now, the next piece of policy by which we're going to cover is the Marital Rape Act of 1991. Now, prior to the Marital Rape Act of 1991, it was argued that women agreed to sexual intercourse when they got married, meaning they are unable to retract or remove consent as it was seen to be part of their wifely duties. Now, this prescribed the idea that women were the male's property and they could do with her what he pleased. Therefore, it wasn't rape, it was him taking what he owned. The Marital Rape Act of 1991 challenged this viewpoint and made it very clear that these past beliefs should no longer be part of modern relationships. Now, this led to rape in marriage being made a criminal act which could be punished by the full extent of the law. In addition to this, stigmatising the rape itself within marriage, removing the idea that this was okay to do so within a relationship. Now, the next piece of policy we're looking at is the Equal Opportunities Act of 2010. Now, this act covers both the personal life as well as employment-based legislation as well. So it's there to make sure vulnerable groups receive the protection that is necessary. Now, with the Equal Opportunities Act, it protects all groups within society. So it's there to make sure nobody encounters discrimination. Now, a few of these groups that are protected by the Act are people of different ages, disabilities, gender reassignments, marriage or civil partnerships, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation, meaning that these are considered to be protected characteristics by the government and it would be illegal for a person to experience any form of discrimination. Now, this can be negative discrimination, so saying, nope, we won't employ you because you're a girl, or it can be positive discrimination by which we can say, yep, I'm going to employ you because you're a girl. So by which both, if they've ever been encountered, are actually punishable by law now. So this is a fantastic piece of act because it's saying that we are trying to move to more of an equal society. Now, the last piece of policy by which we're going to look at today is the Marriage Act of 2013, by which in 2004 civil partnerships were awarded to same-sex couples, by which they gave them some of the same status as the married couples. So in terms of equality, this was not the case, as some characteristics such as property inheritance were still ambiguous within civil partnerships. So the Marriage Act of 2013 allowed for same-sex couples to legally marry and gain the same status and equality and title as heterosexual couples who decide to get married. Now, on the 29th of March 2014, this was the first same-sex marriage that took place. So what we see from here is equality was a big focus. Now, those are our 4 policies there. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to now apply it to Marxism, functionalism and feminism as critiques. Now, if we look at the Beveridge Report, first and foremost, now Marxists would argue that this is supporting the false consciousness because it's giving the impression that the ruling classes are trying to aid the working classes by making sure that these 5 giants, the squalor, ignorance and want, are all dealt with. By doing so, they are ensuring that they have got an appropriate workforce that'll be happy to go out and still fuel the capitalist machine. Functionists, they would argue that by having everyone working towards one main key feature would allow for greater consensus within society, because everyone will eventually be working towards the same norms and values which will be established by the welfare state and the agencies within the welfare state. Now, feminists would say that women are still amongst the oppressed. Women who were single would find it very difficult to make a claim because stigma would still be associated within society. And those who were married found it easier to put in a claim within that welfare state system. Now, the Marital Rape Act of 1991, what Marxists would say about this is the ruling class attempting to make marriage more equal. Now, obviously, this would benefit them in a massive way, because what would happen is if a relationship encountered this dark side of the family, A wife could obviously get her husband prosecuted and a divorce could happen, but then she could still go and procreate within another nuclear family, which means the idea of the reserve workforce is continually being developed. So the capitalists, the ruling class, will never run out of their reserve workforce whatsoever. So by doing so, and by giving the impression that there is equality, it benefits them in the long run. Now, functionists would argue that this is a way of dealing with instability within the family, because what we often ignore with functionists is they only see the family as a bit of a warm bath, if we're going to take a Parsonian idea here, that the family is there to provide comfort and support, and that's why it is a good thing. Now, this in itself is acknowledging that there is a negative side, and this negative side is something by which, if it's dealt with, can ensure that the woman who's within that relationship will go and pursue a nuclear family with another person. Now, for feminists, they argue that, especially for liberal feminists, that this is a good measure to help deal with inequality within society. So what we're seeing here is policies taking a stand and making it very clear that this should not happen within our society, and we need to deal with it appropriately and swiftly. Now, the Equal Opportunities Act here, by what Marxists would say, this is the ruling class allowing working class to feel society is equal. Now, this helps to solidify that false consciousness, as well as hiding the oppression even more so that they're encountering. But in the meantime, they're still being oppressed quite vastly in terms of the way in which they are being exploited for profit by the ruling class. Now, functionists would argue that this allows for greater value consensus and social solidarity, because everyone is now working towards that one key aim, which is for equality for all, and everyone is sharing those same norms and values. So what we would see there is society would be able to grow and prosper, which means society is going to survive ultimately. For feminists, especially radical feminists, that this is ineffective in dealing with patriarchy, because what we're seeing there, you're saying sex and gender is all being recognized as protected characteristics, but actually what are they going to do about this? The only way by which we could really deal with any form of patriarchy or male dominance is by living within a sexual apartheid, by which we separate the sexes from one another and men and women create their own societies in effect. Now, the Marital Marriage Act of 2013 here, what Marx would say, this is attempting to access a new labour force. So by making and accepting same-sex marriage, they are therefore allowing a hidden workforce to appear by which they can further exploit. Functionists would argue that this allows for greater value consensus and social solidarity, because same-sex couples are no longer seen as deviants. They are seen as having the same capabilities as a nuclear heterosexual family. So therefore what we can see and what we can argue is they will still be just as effective in ways of socialising children, as it were. For feminists, they would argue the Marriage Act 2013 allows for women to opt for non-patriarchal relationships. Now, this is a particularly radical feminist viewpoint, because what we can say here very clearly and very firmly is that women can then practice instrumental lesbianism, by which they will begin to pursue relationships with other females, because that is the only type of relationship by which they will not be exploited in. So what we can see here very quickly is a complete update in terms of how Marxist, functionists and feminists view these policies. Now, obviously, if you are speaking about this policy, it's completely worthwhile throwing in an evaluation about this, throwing in a perspective about what the policies actually mean for society. And you could choose any perspective within in sociology to bring this to life. Now, this next slide just basically breaks down your unit when you're answering this within the exam itself. So what you can see is you're going to get 2 10-mark questions and a 20-mark question. Now, one of the 10-mark questions will be an outline and explain question. The other one will be a question which is applying material from an item, analysing 2 perspectives. And then you'll have a 20-mark question, which is an extended essay. Now, the 2 10-mark questions will only take you 15 minutes to answer, and the 20-mark question will take you 30 minutes to answer. So you need to ensure that you're dealing with them in appropriate lengths of time, and you're not being disproportionate amount of dealing with them for the amount of marks that they're offering. Now, this particular slide is just telling us about the two different types of questions that can come up with these 10-mark questions. And the reason why this is essential is because realistically it's telling you what assessment objectives each one of these questions are asking you. Now, the outline and explain, this question requires you to bring in your own knowledge to link together two themes within the question itself. Now, half the marks are for AO1, whilst AO2 and AO3 are also present. Now, for those of us that are worrying and going, what is AO1, what is AO2 and AO3? AO1 is knowledge and understanding, AO2 is application, and AO3 is analysis and evaluation. Now, applying the item and analyse to is the next type of question. Now, this question requires you to find and select two pieces of information from the item and base your answer around them. Now, by doing so, what you are seeing here is all of the assessment objectives are being used. Particularly in focus here is AO2 because you're applying your own knowledge and information from the item. So you have to make sure that this is your priority and you're not neglecting what the examiner is giving you. Now, for the 10 markers, there seems to be a big concern around the structure of these 10 markers. Now, to get 10 out of 10, the basic way to approach this is by writing two detailed paragraphs which link the two parts of the topic identified in the question. Now, what you do have to recognise here with the 10 marker is not necessary for you to write a conclusion or an introduction. Now, if you do choose to write an introduction, I would use this as an opportunity for you to outline and define some of the keywords or concepts that the question is asking you. Now, the main point with the introduction here, as I would do it myself, is making sure that you do not spend an awful lot of time doing the introduction. So maximum 3 sentences, it's there just for definitions and helping you with triggers in terms of writing your response. Now, the way in which we would say for you to tackle these 10-mark questions is by utilising what we label as the sociological sandwich. Now, the sociological sandwich is a very unique way by which it offers you 4 easy ways of creating a really worthwhile paragraph. Now, this is the sociological sandwich. Now, what you can see right at the top, we've got the identify. This is where you state the advantage or disadvantage or one of the reasons why a theoretical perspective has taken this viewpoint. Then what you do next is the describe part, which is use an example to elaborate on your initial point. So can you use a bit of social policy to make it come to life? Can you use an example from a theorist to make it all come together? Then you go through the explain. Now, the explain part here is really where you are bringing your answer to life because you're linking back everything that you so far have said back to the question itself. So this is where you clearly explain why and how this could be considered an advantage or beneficial in any stretch of the imagination. Now, what happens is the last part of the sandwich. Now, this is the most magical of it all. Because this is where you're analysing and you're evaluating. So you analyse the extent to which this has been an advantage. And is there any similar supportive material available? Is there material that can contradict what we've said? And what insight has it really given to us about the methods that are being used or about the particular perspective that is chosen to speak about for this area? Now, this is what we would use as a general structure for our 10 markers. So we'd have 2 of these paragraphs. Now, before I'm going to demonstrate the sociological sandwich, what I want to show you here is a type of question that could have the potential of coming up. Now, this is outline describe 2 arguments that childhood is a social construction. This is a relatively nice question. It's hitting the nails on the head and you can see possibly how you can structure it. So let's have a look at how we've dealt with an answer for this. Now, right at the top with the identifier, you can see what we've written is childhood is argued to be a social construction as children have had a change in status and responsibility. Now, through discourse analysis, sociologists have discovered a change in the way children are viewed and treated. Now, the describe here, so this is us bringing in an example. Now, for example, children within medieval society were often viewed as little adults, and they were expected to take on adult responsibilities as soon as they were physically able to. Now, the explain part, remember this is our link back to the question, explaining why this is a particular viewpoint. Now, Aries here supports the view as childhood didn't exist as a separate status within historical eras, particularly the medieval era. Now, children moved from infancy, where they needed constant care, to taking on a caring and working role within the community. Therefore, it can be argued that childhood is a social construction, as throughout history, the status and position of children has changed. Now, we're doing the magical part at the bottom now. This is the analyse and evaluate part of the question. Now, this is where we state, however, Aries is criticised for claiming that there was no concept of childhood within medieval times, as others argue the conception of childhood was just different. In addition to this, his research was conducted on a unique sample of untypical French aristocrats, which brings into question the accuracy of Aries' account regarding the social construction of childhood. Now, what we can see here, this is a really chunky paragraph. So what you'll need to replicate is another one of these paragraphs within that 10 marker. Now, the next part that we're moving on to is an example of a 20 marker for your family essay. So now, obviously you get a 20 marker, so that's going to be 30 minutes you're going to spend on this. Now, for a 20 marker, you will be expected to write an introduction and conclusion if you're aiming for those top bands. Now, what you can see from this, you get given a present by the examiner, which is your item. So don't look ungrateful, make sure you use this item within your answer. As well as this, the item is serving a purpose. It's giving you some hints and tips as to the potential way that you can deal with the question. Now, what we can see from the question itself, if we look at the buzzwords, you have to make sure you take material from item B and your knowledge. So it's absolutely essential that that item and your knowledge is brought into this. Alongside this, you evaluate the view that the family is a beneficial institution in society. So you need to think of all the different arguments by which we can use to say that it is a beneficial institution alongside why it isn't a beneficial institution. Now, this is just a brief introduction as to how you could structure this particular essay. So if we take a look at the top bit, so introduction is outline the general argument that the two groups of sociologists would take. So whether it's an oppressive function in terms of the family or whether it's beneficial. Now, the other part that you could really bring into account here is the Parsonian ideas around primary socialization, because with primary socialization, what we are seeing is that we are teaching these individuals the basic skills for living and being present within society. By doing so, we're making sure that anomie doesn't occur and therefore society survives. Meanwhile, we'll talk about Anne Oakley as possibly as well, by which she identifies that the family in itself is patriarchal in nature, because it teaches gender stereotypes, expectations about how girls and boys are expected to behave. Now, Duncombe and Marsden here really bring this point to even more so, because they support Anne Oakley in the sense that they're saying that actually, yes, this is happening within the family, it's patriarchal, it's oppressive, because women are expected to pull this triple shift. They're expected to do the childcare, they're expected to do the housework, and they're expected to look after the man in itself. And also, in some families, be a breadwinner. Now, this here is a very interesting dilemma because we're saying that it's negative straight off the bat. However, what we're looking at for Murdoch here is that there are 4 functions within the family, which is obviously economic support, socialization and reproduction amongst the most important. Now, all of those are important because it allows for a good structure to exist within the family. By doing so, we are making sure that we are providing a unit that can be used for stabilization of adult personalities, by which links back into a Parsonian idea around the warm bath, by where it is the family acted as a warm bath which aimed to reduce stress and pressure experienced by its members by the outside world, by offering them a warm and loving environment. How very sweet. Meanwhile, Zaretsky would come in as a bit of criticism towards the warm bath by identifying that actually the family isn't this whole loving, warm thing by which Parsons identified. Actually, in effect, it is one of the most oppressive institutions, because what we're seeing here is the family is simply a way of allowing men to take out their stresses from the day that they've experienced at work, and therefore allowing them to go back out into the capitalist system. Meanwhile, Engels argues that the family is beneficial in a sense because it's there to serve the interests of the ruling class. It ensures that there is a seamless transition in terms of private property when it comes around to inheritance. Now, therefore, when we reach the conclusion of this particular essay, what we do need to recognise is it's hard to generalise all of the results from this research and these views because there are diverse family options out there. And what most of these people focus on in terms of sociological perspectives is actually just the nuclear family. And as we know, more than that exists within our social world. So you can start to bring in the idea from postmodernism, by which we are picking and choosing and delivering alternative family options. Therefore, what we can argue here, it is difficult to claim it's a wholly beneficial institution. And if you were to bring in the dark side of the family, you could do so within your conclusion as well. Now, this is an example of a paragraph. So right at the top there, what we can see is actually a quote from the item. So, socialization which helps to maintain social order by teaching norms and values. Then we move into the explanation. So therefore, the family has some key advantages in helping maintain social order and teaching us the basic norms and values needed for our role in wider society. This is where we develop our point even more so with Parsons. So Parsons, a functionalist, argued the primary socialization is an essential part of becoming functioning members of society, as not only do we learn about acceptable social behaviours, we also learn about the basic skills that make us human, e.g. how to walk and talk. Now we're doing the analysis part here. So this suggests that the family is a beneficial institution in society, as without it, people would not be able to respond appropriately in social situations, and there would be a state of anomie where clear boundaries were not present and understood by all. So this is just a brief example, obviously, of what a paragraph could look like and what could be used within that essay. Now, that is it for today's webinar. Now, what we have got on screen right now, there is the Tutor2U website, which will link you straight to the events for all the webinars that are going on at this moment of time. Why don't you follow the Tutor2U Twitter account, and that will just allow you to keep up to date and spread the word with what we've been offering so far. If you haven't done so already, join our student Facebook group, which is the A-Level Sociology student group. And if you ever need any help or support on there, we are available at all times. Obviously, try to help you as much as possible. Now, that is the end of today's webinar. So this is Essential Sociology Getting Ready for Paper 2, Families and Households. It was a quick summary and a snapshot of obviously what we covered in the webinar. Thank you very much for listening.